For nearly 500 years, the story seemed settled. Christopher Columbus had discovered America. That was the version taught in classrooms, printed in textbooks, and repeated across generations. But what if the story was wrong? What if Europeans had crossed the Atlantic almost 5 centuries earlier? And what if the evidence for that journey survived not in a forgotten manuscript, but inside the DNA of living people? Because hidden within the genetic code of ordinary Icelanders is a mystery that should not exist. A genetic signature linked not to Scandinavia, not to Europe, but to the indigenous peoples of North America. How did it get there? To answer that question, we have to travel back 1,000 years, back to the age of Vikings. Most people know the name Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, a Norse explorer raised among some of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Around the year 1000, Leif sailed west from Greenland into waters no European had ever mapped, or at least, that's the traditional story. The truth is far stranger. According to medieval Icelandic sagas, the discovery of North America may have started completely by accident. A merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing toward Greenland when storms pushed his ship far off course. When the weather finally cleared, he saw land. Not Greenland, not Iceland, a coastline covered with forests. Bjarni never landed. Instead, he turned around and continued home. But his story spread quickly. One listener became obsessed: Leif Erikson. If Bjarni had truly seen land west of Greenland, Leif intended to find it. He purchased Bjarni's ship, assembled a crew, and set sail into the unknown. The sagas describe 3 different lands: Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. The last was the most remarkable. A place of rivers, forests, fish, and wild grapes. A place where winter was milder than Greenland. A place that sounded almost too good to be true. For centuries, historians believed exactly that. It was too good to be true. The sagas had been written hundreds of years after the events they described. No maps existed. No settlements had ever been found. No physical evidence supported the stories. As far as most scholars were concerned, Vinland belonged in the same category as Atlantis. A fascinating legend. Nothing more. And for hundreds of years, that's where the story remained. A myth. But myths have a strange habit. Sometimes they turn out to be true. By the middle of the 20th century, the Viking story seemed finished. The sagas still existed. People still read them. But almost nobody believed they described real events. To most historians, Vinland was simply a medieval fantasy. Then one man decided to test the story. His name was Helge Ingstad, a Norwegian explorer, lawyer, and adventurer. Unlike many academics, Ingstad was willing to consider a radical possibility. What if the sagas were not myths? What if they were historical? Records disguised as stories? If that were true, evidence should still exist somewhere along the Atlantic coast of North America. The problem was finding it. The coastline stretched for thousands of miles. Searching it was like looking for a single lost page in an entire library. Most experts considered the effort hopeless. Ingstad disagreed. He began studying every detail contained within the sagas. Descriptions of coastlines. Descriptions of sailing distances. Descriptions of climate. Descriptions of resources. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The clues repeatedly pointed toward one region: Newfoundland, the northern edge of North America. In 1960, Ingstad and his wife Anne Steen Ingstad arrived there. They spoke with local fishermen. Many residents mentioned unusual grassy mounds near a small village called Lance aux Meadows. The structures had been there for generations. Most people assumed they were natural. The Ingstads were not convinced. Excavations soon began. What they uncovered changed history. Beneath the soil were the remains of buildings. Not indigenous buildings, not colonial buildings. Norse buildings. The architecture matched Viking settlements found in Greenland and Iceland. The walls were made from turf. The layout was unmistakably Scandinavian. For the first time in history, physical evidence of Vikings in North America had been discovered. But archaeology demands more than assumptions. The structures had to be dated. The artifacts had to be analyzed. Every detail had to survive scientific scrutiny, and one by one, they did. Researchers found iron-working evidence. This was critical. At that time, local indigenous populations in the region were not producing iron using Norse techniques. The presence of iron smelting strongly suggested a Viking origin. Then came another discovery: a bronze cloak pin. Its design was unmistakably Norse. The evidence continued to grow. woodworking debris, boat repair materials, workshops, living quarters. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. Vikings had not merely visited North America, they had lived there. The settlement was eventually recognized as the first confirmed European site in the Americas, nearly 500 years before Columbus. The implications were enormous. For centuries, historians had debated whether the sagas contained any truth. Now, archaeology had answered. They did, but the discovery created a new mystery. If the Vikings reached America around the year 1000, why didn't they stay? The Americas offered resources unavailable in Greenland. Forests, game, fresh water, rich fishing grounds. On paper, Vinland seemed far more attractive than the harsh environments the Norse already inhabited. Yet the settlements vanished, the longships stopped arriving, the colony disappeared. Why? The answer may lie in another part of the sagas. The Vikings described encounters with people they called Skraelings. The exact identity of these groups remains debated. Most historians believe they were indigenous peoples living in the region. At first, trade appears to have occurred, but according to the sagas, tensions eventually escalated. Conflicts broke out. The Norse settlers were vastly outnumbered. Unlike Greenland, Vinland was not empty. It was already home to people whose ancestors had lived there for thousands of years. Maintaining a distant colony across the Atlantic suddenly became far less practical. Eventually, the settlement was abandoned. The colony disappeared. And over time, memory faded. The voyages survived only in stories that many people dismissed. Yet archaeology was not finished. In fact, some of the strongest evidence had not even been discovered yet. Because while researchers were uncovering buildings and artifacts in Newfoundland, another scientific revolution was quietly beginning. A revolution that would eventually produce evidence even more extraordinary than Viking houses. Evidence hidden inside trees and inside human DNA. In 2021, researchers announced one of the most important discoveries in Viking history. Using advanced analysis of tree rings, scientists examined wooden artifacts recovered from Lonso Meadows. These trees contained a unique cosmic radiation signature, a marker created by a solar event known to have occurred in the year 993. Because scientists knew exactly where that marker appeared inside the wood, they could count the growth rings that formed afterward. The result was astonishing. The trees had been cut in the year 1021. Not approximately, not within a century, not within decades. The exact year. For the first time in history, scholars possessed a precise date for European activity in the Americas. The Vikings had reached North America nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. At this point, the case seemed closed. The sagas had been confirmed. The settlement had been found. The date had been established. History had been rewritten, or so it appeared. Because hidden within a completely different field of science, another mystery was beginning to emerge. A mystery that archaeology alone could never explain. A mystery that suggested the Vikings may have left behind something far more important than buildings. Something that survived long after every house collapsed. Long after every ship rotted away. Long after every settlement disappeared. A living trace, one that would survive for 1,000 years and lead researchers toward a discovery nobody expected. Archaeology had already proven that Vikings reached North America. The settlement at Lonso Meadows was real. The date, 1021, was real. The voyages, described in the sagas, were real for most historians. The mystery seemed solved. The Vikings came, they stayed briefly, they left, end of story. But science has a habit of reopening closed cases, and this time, the evidence wasn't buried underground. It was hidden inside human DNA. Everything began in Iceland. At first, researchers weren't looking for evidence of Viking contact with America. They were studying genetic lineages within the Icelandic population. Iceland is a unique place for this kind of research. The island was settled relatively recently. Historical records are unusually detailed. Family histories can often be traced back many centuries. This makes Iceland one of the most valuable places on Earth for studying genetic ancestry. As scientists examined mitochondrial DNA, they noticed something strange. One genetic lineage didn't seem to belong. It was called C1. At first glance, that name means almost nothing. But to geneticists, it raised an immediate question, because C1 is associated primarily with indigenous peoples of the Americas, not Scandinavia, not Britain, not continental Europe, but America. That shouldn't have been possible. The lineage appeared in several Icelandic families, families whose ancestry could be traced back centuries. Yet, the genetic marker itself seemed completely out of place. So, researchers began investigating. Could this be a modern introduction? Could it have arrived after Columbus? Could recent migration explain it? One by one, those possibilities fell apart. Historical records showed the lineage had existed in Iceland long before modern migration. Genealogical analysis pushed its presence back hundreds of years. Eventually, researchers reached a startling conclusion. The Sykophomid's most likely explanation was that the lineage entered Iceland around the year 1000 exactly, when Vikings were traveling between Greenland and North America. Suddenly, the pieces began to fit together. The Vikings reached America. The Vikings interacted with local populations, and somewhere within those interactions, at least one indigenous American woman may have crossed the Atlantic, not in the modern era, not after Columbus, nearly 1,000 years ago. If true, the implications are extraordinary because it means the contact between Europe and America was not a brief encounter observed from a distance. It was personal. Human. Families may have formed, lives may have become intertwined, history may have unfolded in ways never recorded by any chronicler. Think about that for a moment. 1,000 years ago, a woman born somewhere in North America may have boarded a Norse ship. We do not know her name. We do not know her language. We do not know whether she left willingly. We do not know where she lived. We do not know what happened during her journey. Yet if the genetic evidence is correct, part of her story survived, not in a book, not in a monument, not in a legend, inside people, generation after generation, for nearly 1,000 years. That may be the most remarkable part of this entire story, because buildings collapse, ships decay, settlements disappear, but DNA remembers, carries fragments of journeys long after history forgets them. Of course, not every scientist agrees on every detail. Questions remain. Debates continue. Some researchers argue that alternative explanations are still possible. Others believe the EBDUH evidence strongly supports pre-Columbian contact. That is how science works. But regardless of where future discoveries lead, one fact is now beyond dispute. The Vikings reached North America. That much has been proven. The old stories were not myths. The sagas were not fantasy. For centuries, people laughed at the idea. Today, archaeology has confirmed it, and genetics may be revealing something even bigger. Because the true significance of the Viking voyages isn't that they arrived in America before Columbus. That fact alone is fascinating, but it isn't the real story. The real story is what happened next. For generations, history portrayed the Atlantic Ocean as a barrier separating two worlds, Europe on one side, America on the other. Yet, 1,000 years ago, that barrier may already have been broken, not by empires, not by armies, not by conquerors, but by a handful of explorers sailing into the unknown. Their settlements vanished, their voyages were forgotten, their discoveries disappeared from memory, and yet traces remained. Hidden in the soil, hidden in ancient wood, hidden in human DNA waiting centuries to be found. Perhaps that is the strangest lesson of all. History is not a collection of dates, it is a collection of people who lived, people who traveled, people who met one another, and sometimes people who changed the world without ever realizing it. 1,000 years ago, a Viking ship crossed the Atlantic. At the time, nobody aboard could have imagined that scientists would still be studying their journey. A millennium later, they could not have imagined genetic laboratories. They could not have imagined archaeology. They could not have imagined modern history books. Yet their story survived, not because they built great cities, not because they founded powerful kingdoms, but because they left behind evidence strong enough to outlive an entire millennium. And that brings us back to the question we asked at the beginning: did the Vikings reach America before Columbus? Yes, the evidence leaves little doubt, but perhaps that was never the most important question. The more important question is this: what traces of that encounter still exist today? And if one unexpected genetic lineage survived for 1,000 years, how many other forgotten stories are still waiting to be discovered? Because the Vikings reached America, and in the only way that truly matters, they may never have left,